Welcome back to our listeners and viewers of The Responsible Edge, the podcast where we explore the bold ideas, uncomfortable truths, and unexpected solutions shaping the future of responsible business. Our article this week is Oliver Bark's revealing interview, Why Future 500's Walworth says companies under fire from critics should build bridges, not bunkers, unpacking how behind-the-scenes dialogue, not bold public gestures, might be the future of corporate responsibility. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that my guest joining me today is Assheton Carter. He's the founder of TDI Sustainability and the Impact Facility, and a long-time advisor on responsible sourcing, mining, and ESG strategy. Assheton, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Charlie, it's great to be here too. I looked at many of your past podcasts, really enjoyed them, so it's a thrill to be on the show.
Oh, well, you've started with already a glowing endorsement of the show, so you are already in the higher echelons of my favorite guest to date, Assheton, if I can get my words out. I very briefly introduced TDI Sustainability there and your work, but for those of our listeners and guests that aren't aware of what you guys are doing, can you just give us a little bit more of a flavor as to the organization, perhaps some of your other initiatives you're involved in, and your role within?
Yes, thanks. The TDI Sustainability, we've been around for about kind of 10 years, and I started TDI Sustainability almost at the same time as I founded the Impact Facility. And really, to me, it's like two sides of the same coin. TDI Sustainability clients are mostly businesses, and we help them move their dial towards being more responsible, corporate sustainability, which is really kind of helping them manage their risk and have a greater impact wherever they can. The Impact Facility, on the other hand, recognizes really the limits to what corporate social responsibility or voluntary action can bring about from corporates. And it's about investing into communities where businesses have a presence, and really managing projects and programs there that address the most difficult and stubborn problems of our time, really. So poverty and environmental issues as well, but bringing in the companies to be a part of that.
That's fascinating, actually. Again, excuse my absolute ignorance and naivety here, but I think there's always good questions to ask. So am I right in thinking that essentially you're describing it as there's always going to be a limit to the impact that corporate organizations can have, and the Impact Facility is a way of organizations be acknowledging that and being able to work through you in order to have a bigger impact on some of those societal issues that you've just described?
You've hit the nail on the head. That's exactly it. A company has boundaries. It has its own activities, its own operations. That's now expanded over the last 10, 15 years, where they're now having more responsibility or expectations on helping their supply chain become more responsible, or certainly being accountable to do that. But even those have limits. At the end of the day, there's poverty, there's governance problems, there's environmental disasters. Those aren't all a cause of companies' activities. There can be governance issues as well. But also there's a cumulative impact. So it's difficult to identify where you as an individual company can have a broad impact and therefore a responsibility over many things. So you have to have some sort of platform where you can join with others to address some of those societal problems.
And out of interest, how many of your TDI sustainability clients are working with you guys via the Impact Facility as well? Is it a fairly high percentage?
We have kind of two different vehicles. We have the Impact Facility, where we have many of our clients who are working on that as well. So Tesla, for example, is part of the Fair Cobalt Alliance. Google is there. Fairphone is there. Big mining companies like Glencore are there. So we help them both on their more kind of risk management side and responsible business side, but then they're also investing in that. And then we have another work stream, if you want, where we work with collectives. So we have groups of companies, or we have multi-stakeholder initiatives where companies come together, and sometimes with nonprofits and other kind of knowledge partners, to find a solution to a common problem. So outside of the minerals and metals space, we have we're working with the pharmaceutical industry on something called SIPA, which is about recycling, having take-back schemes for pharmaceutical packaging. We have another one which is working on natural polymers, so non-plastic plastics, where the individual companies have got together to work. We have one in the Colored Gemstone Working Group, where luxury companies have come together, and another one in Sweden, for example. So we're big believers in the collective to solve some of these stubborn societal problems that we all face and are intensifying.
I feel like I could do a whole show. Perhaps if I manage to convince you to come back on, we'll do a deeper dive into collaboration and partner. It's a theme that comes up again and again on the Responsible Edge. And I just love the fact that the impact facility is essentially there to facilitate more of that from what you've just described. And I'd love to pick into it a bit more, but for another show. Ashton, I'm sure our listeners and viewers, and again, those that want to, we're going to link to your LinkedIn profile so people can go and check out like the depth and the origin story themselves on sort of black and white, if you like. But I'm really intrigued to hear it from you directly. How do we end up here? Take us back to, the beginning, the origin, if you like, of you and what's inspired you at whatever stage, going through childhood or perhaps university or perhaps early part of your career. How have we ended up here?
Well, it's certainly not linear. And I guess it is kind of gradual, kind of the road to Damascus moment, if you want. I started straight out of school in the city of London. So I was a dealer and what used to call then a stockbroker, asset manager, institutional advisory, where I kind of learned about business. And that was in the mid 80s and early 90s. So this was when Mrs. Thatcher was coming in with the deregulation, and you could start to sell stocks and shares to kind of me and you, people on the street, and what we now call retail. And people used to come in and pay their bills with cash. They used to bring in tens of thousands of pounds to pay for the shares that they bought. So it was a totally deregulated atmosphere. And this is, of course, the time of the Wolf of Wall Street as well. And so, you could, and I think my family's, my mother's side of the family, a banking family. So they've for several generations. And, when I first started in the city, there's the explanation for how capitalism works, and really capital goes into companies which are doing good things, responding to what's happening in society, creating value, creating services and products that people want. You invest in the company does well, everybody does well. And that was a dream. But of course, when I started, it was also the same time that all the derivatives market started, and people made just as much money out of things going badly. So, Gary Stevenson talks about this a lot in his book, that if you follow him. And so I kind of begun to understand what the reality is. And then I guess I became a little bit more curious. And then coincidentally, I kind of looking for the next job, and I realized I didn't have an education beyond A-levels, which I kind of failed with flying colors. So I kind of combined the two things. I get an education on business, but then I always looked at the societal impacts of business and how businesses could actually contribute, and if they could contribute or not. And then went on to do a PhD in what I thought was like the most difficult thing I could pick, which is on responsible mining and sustainability and power and participation. That took me into working in this career-long research question, if you want, is how can businesses contribute to or be a part of what society is trying to be and what problems they're trying to solve.
Actually, that was an absolutely sensational nutshell, and I was very keen to not interrupt you while you were in full flight. But that was absolutely fantastic. I'm gonna, as I say, your LinkedIn profile, we'll link to it. People can go and check out, and obviously TDI Sustainability and the Impact Facility, so everyone can go and dive into the depths. Will be in all of our materials. Mining for your PhD, like what you mentioned, like you wanted to sort of pose the most challenging, difficult question going. Was that down to the fact that you just, initially before starting it thought, how am I going to prove that mining can be done, or has got a responsible or sustainable outlook? Is that what drew you to mining, or did you have any other kind of consideration that went into it?
Well, there's also a very kind of practical part of it is that I just answered an advertisement in The Guardian, I think, for a PhD scholarship at Bath Uni, and it was on mining. But I thought at the time, well, if I can understand and solve that problem, then I've solved the biggest problem, and everything else is going to be plain sailing after that. But of course, what you learn is that mining compared to other sectors isn't as bad as you might think, because mining is a temporary land use. It's actually a relatively small footprint compared to agriculture, and it contributes a lot to society. So you begin to sort of question all these things and what the perception is about these different sectors. But yes, you're kind of fundamentally right, is that Ruggie used to say, you can't save the angels. So, let's actually work with the most difficult things, and then everything else becomes, simpler by comparison. That's for sure.
And let me ask you this. So you kind of alluded to this here, but I'm fascinated because obviously TDI Sustainability, as you've alluded to before, you guys do a lot of work in the mining sector, if I've understood, going through cases, etc., correctly. Like, since you sort of moved out of the financial services world and sort of redirected yourself towards this really interesting. In fact, before I go into my long-winded question, what age are you at when you made that decision to move out of FS and go back and do your PhD?
Sort of mid to late 20s, yeah.
Okay, interesting. I often get people that come on the show and talk about that period as a kind of a key fundamental pivot moment. Like, a lot of people seem to have worked things out a little bit more about themselves and about the view of the world. And that's often a really important change moment. But it really comes down to the people that have enough courage, if you like, because I presume that, you were giving up a sort of a significantly clear direction that your career could have taken to go, no, this is more me. This is the pivot point that I need to grab with both hands. Is that, just touch on that from a personal perspective? What was that like for you to go and sort of make that decision in that period in your life?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's you have a kind of moment to be more reflexive after you've been enjoying yourself for, several years in London and burning a candle at both ends. And I think then you kind of project forward and go, will I be doing this? And I think in the city at that time, and indeed now, you can make a mistake and then you're gone. And while I was there, London financial sector was, captured by the Americans, essentially. The Americans came over and going, oh my goodness, look at this. London's fast asleep. Let's buy up all the companies, which they did. And then you saw people lost their jobs very quickly. So you can say, yes, they're good times. When things are going well, everything goes well, then everybody kind of rides the market. But when things aren't going so well, it's pretty ruthless. So this isn't a guaranteed job. And so that's, of course, that short-termism makes people kind of cut corners a little bit, or see how they can maximize their returns. So yeah, at that point I go, to be honest with myself, am I really going to be doing this when I'm 40, when I'm 50? Is this now time to retrain and do something else? Always fascinated with business, how value is created, how companies capture business, why companies are sustainable, by which I mean, why do they have a long lifespan?
Yeah.
Which is short. Then, response able, are they able to respond to what society is asking them to do? And then at the same time, concerned, as people are even more now, about what's happening to our natural planet and the injustices around the world. And so you put those two things together and you go, what is the role of business? What is responsible business?
And you were brilliantly segued me back to my previous question, which I'm going to conclude with, actually, as my final question for you before we move on to this week's article. When you think about, because I imagine you then finish your PhD in kind of your early 30s or around that sort of period, if you like. Mm-hmm. you've then, had this career in working in sort of responsible corporate practice. Like, what's changed in your time? Like, what have been the key fundamental trends and ways that the world has evolved in that period that you sort of highlight as being kind of fundamental changes? Like, can you just give us a reflection, if you like, on what's happened in that time?
I mean, I think what's happened in this, what do you want to call this world, corporate responsibility, social responsibility, corporate sustainability world, one thing is that it's become much more professionalized. So, when I started, it really wasn't a thing, people, at university, they didn't think it was a discipline at all. So what were you actually, but now you have whole MBAs based on this world and so on. And in companies, there was no function, there was no senior position. So that's definitely happened. So that's both a kind of a good thing and a bad thing. I think it's sort of a shame that but it's been noticed by the corporate world. The bad thing potentially is that they become better at covering up things that they do because they're very good at deflecting and become more professional. So it's captured in that way. So that's definitely one change. In terms of the kind of the context in which we live in, I mean, just in the last few years, as we all know, what has really changed is the acceleration in the influence of social media and how companies had to respond to that. And so that opens up a really interesting study on whether they really are responsible and what does responsible mean, and are their actions sustainable and making a difference, or are they just literally responding to a news cycle? So that's kind of really interesting. And then I think some of the big problems in the article that we're going to discuss, it talks what I would call about more kind of local problems, like one company or a project of a company. But the problems that we have to face now are much broader than that, either spatially, so they cover whole regions, or things like kind of climate change that knows no boundaries, or they're more abstract, more difficult to sort of get your hands over, things like artificial AI. I mean, there's a whole lot of moral and environmental and all sorts of problems around that as well. So these problems have become much bigger. So I guess our question is, are we equipped, and how can companies respond to that? And have they got the right motivations to do it?
Last question for you on exactly that point. Are you looking ahead, and you've already alluded to a number of the problems that we face from a societal perspective, if you like, from a collective perspective, how much hope do you retain that we're going to manage to come together to address these issues? Like, I know it's a big, broad question, but just you personally, how hopeful are you that we have the capacity for change that's needed?
Well, I'm always hopeful that we have the capacity to change. What I'm hoping that the younger generations and mine are able to have the courage to respond, because I think the biggest problem we face is going to be the governance problem now, and how do we get aligned interests. But yeah, always optimistic. Who's going to lead? That's another question.
Again, it's a theme that keeps coming up again and again on the Responsible Edge, and I appreciate the highlighting of it again, and I appreciate the fact that we are going to head into our discussion of this article on an optimistic footing. Ashley, if possible, and again, sorry, I know that was a whistle-stop tour through you, but again, hopefully we'll get you back on and we can dive into one of the chapters in a bit more depth. But for now, would you mind possibly just introducing and summarizing Eric's article that we're going to be going through today, just giving us a little bit of an overview, and then perhaps just picking out whatever you thought was most interesting in the piece?
Yeah, so the article, which is Why Future 500's Wolgamuth, I hope we haven't crucified the pronunciation of that name, says companies under fire from critics should build bridges, not bunkers. So Future 500 is a New York company, or US-based company, which is advising Fortune 500, I assume, companies on their stakeholder management. And it uses a case study of one of the clients who is coming across criticism, quite kind of persistent criticism, about one of their projects in a different country. I can't remember, was it agricultural or forestry? But anyway, I think it's a natural resource project. And, what he explains is that, or what the article explains is that no response is not a good response in terms of managing that risk. So the implication there that there is the risk, but I would say that needs to be further explored what the actual risk is. And that instead, rather than staying stumm, companies are better off to have a dialogue. That dialogue can take place behind the scenes. That dialogue should get personal, is what they're saying. So go out and meet the CEO to CEO, if you want, CEO of the company to CEO of the advocacy organization, find common ground. In this case, they went fly fishing, which is now a nice middle class activity. And then the warm this could take a long time. But essentially saying, don't bury your head in the ground. You need to get out there and dialogue.
Actually, that was, and by the way, that was a great summary. And again, for our listeners and viewers that want to check it out, we'll link to the source article so people can go and check it out. But Assheton's nailed the kind of overarching summary, I think, there. How much of this did you agree with for thinking about, the clients that you work with and the experience that you've had? Like, is this the blueprint for how we go about engaging in, difficult conversations with people that perhaps don't hold the same view or intent as we do as companies?
I mean, in part, yes. I mean, it's good to have dialogue, kind of always. I think that's a truism. However, I guess where I push back is that it's not generic blueprint. It's not always going to work in every case. In fact, staying stumm can be a benefit. It does actually work sometimes. I mean, I remember years ago when I was at Warwick Business School, we used to hold meetings on corporate social responsibility, as it's called that time, with leading companies. And one of those companies was a company which manufactured antidepressant drugs. And those antidepressant drugs have been in the news for being the cause of suicide by some who used it. They said at that time that actually, what the board decided was just to say stumm, and it actually did go away. So they didn't happen. So for the idea that staying, dialogue is a good thing to do works if it's being picked up in the news cycle and there's persistent opposition. Another one is that, there's a company which had some deaths of small-scale miners in the community around their mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This is the sort of thing which can really flare up and cause a problem. But in fact, no one picked it up. So it doesn't become the news. We did a study. We did a study a couple of years ago called Sin Stocks, and there we looked at ranching companies in Brazil. And this company was incredibly successful in its corruption. It could bribe thousands of government officials, hundreds of government officials, and it hadn't been found out for years. Then it was found out, and then absolutely the share price in New York tumbled. But then after about 4 months, it recovered. So,
having not engaged in any recognition, any dialogue, they just allowed it to play out and weathered the storm.
Yeah, because the rules are that if it depends, like, you've got to define what the risk is. So do they mean the risk in terms of the valuation, or do they mean risk in terms of being, like Elon Musk, people not buying the product? So that's, the first one is, basically a financial risk, a market risk. Is the market going to undervalue your stock? Or what markets do is they look at the fundamentals. So, the cynical man there would go, well, if a company is hit hard by a scandal, the best time to buy is in the 3 months after that scandal, if the fundamentals are right, because then it'll pick up. If you're talking about your product, yes, well, we know exactly where that has gone wrong. So you've got to identify what risk we're talking about. I think talking about risk generically isn't very helpful. But, generally, yes. I mean, if there is a persistent campaign against you, yeah, you've got to get out there and start talking and understand. So that's wonderful.
And is Ashley, is that the key? Because I'm trying to think about this kind of strategically. Like, is it when you're advising clients, when you're thinking about these sorts of situations, if you like, is it if it's persistent, if there's a pattern, that then dialogue is required. But if it's not, then there's an opportunity that it might be a single instance and it can go away on its own. Is it? I mean, I'm dramatically oversimplifying things here, but is that one of the key strategic sort of approaches, if you like, to engaging in this sort of dialogue or not?
It's a bit of an oversimplification, but I mean, again, this is why I have TDI and the impact facility. TDI is our clients are the companies. So we're looking after their companies so they can be sustainable, more sustained companies, which means they need to manage their risk. So when something emerges like that, we don't just rely on, an opinion or what they think is good for them. We're much more rigorous about it. And so the methodology that I use, which I did part of my kind of PhD, and going back to the academic literature, you have to look at kind of three things. You've got to look at the power of the claimant. So what is the claim against you? What is the power of that individual or that advocacy organization or NGO? What is the legitimacy of their claim? Is it actually happening or not? And what is the urgency? Is this tomorrow or is this in the next decade? And then you combine those things and go, right, how should we react to that? And so, it's a discipline, I think, rather than just a hunch or a sensibility. You've got to get in there and really understand it. And, another thing where this can fall down is like you can talk to them. And dialogue is always a good idea if you've been through that process. But what happens if their claim is legitimate? And, I think it's in 1999, Peter Schwartz, who's author who wrote The Art of Belonging, he also wrote a book called When Good Companies Do Bad Things. If it's not on your radar as a company, you don't, notice it as being a bad thing, then you just end up doing bad things. Then any dialogue isn't going to, excuse what you've done. You can't dialogue away, the Macondo, the oil spill, for example. That is, that then becomes a response is then outrage. And outrage has to be met with just repeated and persistent apologies and putting it right again. So, if you have done a bad thing, even if you intended to or not, it's not about a point of view. It's about putting it right.
Yeah, here. You're going to get your first here of the show, Ashton. I give them out for particular points I think are perfect from guests, and I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, thinking about both the article, but equally thinking about your career, are we, in your mind, are we asking too much of the world's companies? Are we expecting them to be sort of both, market leaders, enabling profit maximization for shareholders, but also moral leaders in a sense? Like, are we just asking too much of the corporate world?
Yeah, there's another kind of strain there about the CEO as a superstar. That's quite a new phenomenon. CEOs used to be quite kind of boring administrative caretakers, not people who are supposed to stand on the stages and steer governments, steer society in a certain way. I mean, I think about in terms of alignment. So my expectations aren't that you're suddenly going to change a company which is basically a vehicle to make profits and distribute those profits amongst its shareholders. You're not going to turn that into an agency, a development agency. That's not their job. This is quite a strange analogy, but we got dogs. We love our dogs. We give them human names. They sleep on the bed and so on. And, they get better treatment than our kids, but they have a fundamental innate nature. And, our warning is if you try and take their food, they'll bite you, right? If you push companies too far to reduce their profit margins, they're going to push right back. So that alignment, in my world because there's more kind of voluntary actions for companies, there's got to be a reason for them to do it. And there's, the drivers are absolutely regulation, absolutely access to resources, access to capital, access to new markets or maintaining their existing markets and customers. if those things then align, and that's kind of where the mission is, if we can get those to align what society needs, then you've got a possibility to get them to contribute directly. And I think the comment I made earlier on about the life of a company has gone S&P 500, 1920, the average life was something like 60 years. Now it's like 15. The companies which have the longest life are in Japan, And if you look, they adapt, but they adapt to what society needs because they're actually, this is response-able. They're able to respond to what society needs and they get new products and services. Now it's like everyone's looking for the valuation and the exit. So there's no kind of direct route, or more difficult to have a direct sense of what it is that society is asking of you. So yes, I think we ask too much if we try and say they should do things that aren't in their interests. And really the goal is to be, how can we make it sure that it is in their interests? And there we've got to keep on turning all these different dials to ensure that they are actually aligned with what society is asking of them.
Brilliant suggestion. You're gonna magic wand at the end, so I imagine that we might come back to some of what you've just described when we get there. But actually, I want to ask you, like, slightly segueing out of the article, but I'm fascinated by this in light of what you just said. From a TDI sustainability perspective, do you have any like particular no-go areas or criteria around who you will or won't work with? Like what makes an ideal client for TDI sustainability?
I think there's kind of like two different questions there. There's some things which I'd rather not do. But again, as I said at the beginning, we can't save the angels. So there's, if you're going to work with the perfect company, Patagonia, everybody loves Patagonia. You go, well, we can't help Patagonia. They've got it. They got their big niche. They know what they're doing. That's not interesting. So yeah, we will work with coal companies. We say, well, why would you work with a coal company? Why would you work with a coal mining company? You go, well, because the product is not something we want. To go, yes, but if you think about coal mining, it's still got communities around the coal mine. Are we going to abandon those communities just because we don't think we should be using fossil fuels? You can still do things at the same time. So there aren't many sectors where I would say we wouldn't work with. I mean, where we would shy away a little bit or not prioritize is those sectors which we feel the product doesn't really, help society and it's not having a big enough impact to make a change. Those, by and large, no. Then I think it's how can we help companies? So basically, that's our job: is how can we create value and how can we help companies on their journey? And I think the perfect client is one where there's always some starting point. There's always a pain point. They come up against a compliance problem, or it's a reputation problem, or they've got to make their operations more efficient and address these issues. But when they get into it, they realize there's these different aspects as well. And so it's like, we'll start with you on your journey, wherever that is, and then we'll start trying to unravel it. And that doesn't mean that's fine if you're the old economy, you're just trying to tweak your model so that you're more sustainable. And so we will work with the mining companies and the refiners and these sectors which have been around forever. But we'll also work with companies who are doing something completely new, like the polymers group, where they have this non-plastic polymers made from seaweed. This is a new industry making a big difference. So we work with them.
Ashton, that was brilliantly described. I'm going to play devil's advocate question for you, and feel free to give me an absolute forward defensive to this question, should you wish. I'm a big cricket fan, by the way. You get it. Any cricket ending analogies in if I can. I've spoken to a lot of people now regarding various different things. Climate change and the environment has been a kind of core and fundamental theme of a number of shows. And what really comes across from the conversations I've had with climate scientists and people that are working close in the space is that we really don't understand and appreciate just how radical the change is that we need in order to address some of the fundamental climate issues and environmental issues at play. How do we reconcile the kind of pragmatism that you've described there of it's multifaceted, there's multi-stakeholders to consider when it comes to, for example, a mining company or a coal or fossil fuel company's operation versus this growing narrative that we're hearing that, there have only been 2 instances in the 21st century where we've seen anywhere near the kind of reduction in emissions that are required on a long-term basis. And that was the 2008 financial crisis sort of post and COVID, which was obviously a radically different experience for the majority of us in terms of the way that we operate and the way that we engage with the world. What do you say to that? Like, you're going to provide a much more eloquent response than my questions presented, but what would be your response to that kind of that query?
So I guess it's a response to what needs to happen generally to bring about the future that we want, or a future at all. And then there's a question about what we do within the context of TDI, so working in that kind of more voluntary space or TIF. And, my kind of study, if you want, is business in society. So what needs to happen for those different actors in society to contribute towards that end. There's some things that companies just can't do, and signals that need to be sent by government, and that you can't require boardrooms, or you can't expect boardrooms to respond to. And, what went wrong with the, I built the first standard for REDD+, which is a forest-based carbon offsets. Mm-hmm. And that, basically nothing happened for a decade and a half. And that was because there was not because the technology wasn't good. We came up with a good standard and we had demonstration projects and so on and so forth, but because there wasn't a strong enough government signal. So it comes back to that alignment. If you're a company, why on earth would you voluntarily give away all this money if there isn't some benefit for you? So there has to be that signal, and that signal has got to come from regulators or customers or markets or whatever it is. If you haven't got that, so it's a collective problem that we have. Companies should absolutely respond and innovate around it, but for them to do that and continue to make profits for their shareholders, they need to have a signal to make it happen, and that's where government comes in. At the moment, we've got 2 types of governments at the moment in many kind of countries in Europe and North America. You've either got the kind of the centrists, the Starmers, who or the Sunaks for that matter, who are sort of somewhere in the middle, and they're saying we just need to make our government more efficient, but it's basically okay. Or you've got the populists. But what we really need is someone who isn't a populist, like the Trumps, who are all about deregulation, but is bold enough to understand where we need to go and can make the case, and then companies can respond. So I then go for it. Well, what's my role in this? I can do 2 things at the same time. I can advocate for policy change. I can be active like that. I can be working the impact facility and saying we're doing things on the ground which we think need to happen, and that governments need to contribute to that, while at the same time helping companies understand what their role is in that, given the context in which they're operating in, and they still want to employ people and sell products and services. But I don't actually see, some people sort of say, well, isn't there a contradiction? I'm going, well, no, I think I'm capable of holding 2 opposing views and actions in the mind at the same time, finding the right platform to act on those.
And ultimately, and I'm so pleased you responded to that in that way, because ultimately it's we live in an imperfect world. We have to be pragmatic about the rules of the game that we're currently playing in. And as you've just described, there are levers that can be pulled on in multiple areas in order to enable general progress, if you like, towards the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And that's the only realistic and pragmatic way of viewing, the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
I see the whole thing in systems. I'm a big believer in, and my team always get a little bit tired. We talk about Donna Meadows. Donna Meadows as the kind of the godmother of systems thinking from my point of view. And then Donna Meadows she has a hierarchy of what levers you can pull in a system to bring about change. Right at the bottom of the hierarchy, which I think there are kind of 12s, a scale of 12, right in the bottom of that, the 12th is, standards and metrics. And that's what everybody reaches for in regulations. We've got to have a standard, we've got to regulate, we've got to force. But that's the weakest lever. The strongest lever is really, two strongest levers are right at the top second from the top is like the goal and the purpose. What are we trying to achieve here? And that's why I go back to companies. Are they trying to, essentially they work in a context where they're trying to achieve maximum long-term returns for their investors. And for that to be aligned with society's interests, then you've got to have a way to, for them to have to respond to those stimuli market. And that can come to later, which is missing in things like AI. And right at the top of this is a different worldview. So once you've got the worldview aligned and you've got the purpose aligned, then everything else follows. So, that if we want to change things, that's what we've got to get to. Well, those are the levers we have to pull.
Actually, I love it. You've to provide a clear blueprint that our listeners and viewers can listen in on how we go about enabling that change. And as you say, the most fundamental levers for us to pull, I think, is a brilliant way to sort of conclude this section of our conversation. I'm absolutely fascinated to know what you're going to do with your magic wand. Remembering that there's only one rule with the magic wand: you cannot ask for multiple magic wands. But let me throw it at you now. Actually, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Okay, that's a shame because I was going to come out with two there, but
do you know what? Actually, on the basis that this has been an absolutely brilliantly insightful conversation, have two.
Great. Well, because in the context of the business and society, it's relationship between the different actors in society. So I think the magic wand we have to wave right now is around governance. And so we need to have step up. Companies will only change there. So the governance is weakening. If we want companies to be aligned, we need to have strong governance. If we were going to talk about AI, I could talk about that, but that's just a fantastic example where we have companies, very small number of companies, who are going to control the power of this amazing new technology. No one knows where it's headed, but there is no governance there. So we are relying then on the goodwill of the leaders of those companies to do the right thing. I think that's not the kind of risk I'd want to take. So one thing is governance. We need to serve that. Mm-hmm. The other thing which kind of put me out of a job is like, if we want companies to be closer to society, closer to communities and be aligned with what is needed, then they need to have greater participation in those companies. So I think it'd be a model where we somehow find a way to scale up employee-owned companies, have greater participation in that. That I think would kind of probably shift things in the right direction.
I love it. I mean, you can see how those two outcomes being realized in an instantaneous fashion. You imagine the world that we wake up to on Monday morning would probably look quite different. Assheton, I'm going to conclude it there. I could ask you way more questions, but I've got my producers' concerns in my ears. So I'm going to leave it there. Assheton, thank you so much for joining me this morning. That was an absolutely fantastic show. Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny. Great to be a part of it.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thanks to our guest, Assheton Carter, whose insights from the field and the C-suite help ground this big picture debate in lived experience. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the independent mark of integrity for sustainability reporting. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.